Amen. Thank you. And a special welcome to our friends who are watching on Zoom. It's a new world. Dear God, thank you for this gathering, for our celebration. Open our eyes. Help us see you and help us see ourselves in you too. Amen. You know, when ministers get together like everybody else, we talk shop. We compare notes about preaching. We tell little stories about the wedding where the groom has fainted, funeral where the funeral director is inebriated. Yeah, we know like everybody else that stuff happens. And we know you can't control everything, especially at weddings and funerals, the kind of places where people you've never met always play critical roles, and you're often on their turf, not yours. But you know, the last place you expect something to go wrong is in your own church. And I'll tell you, the last time you wanted disasters on Easter. Now, if you're new here this morning, you may not know that every year here at Westminster, we observe the decorating of the cross with flowers. It's our special celebration, goes way back. You must have noticed that there is a fair amount of chaos involved, and that it's a little like the running of the bulls at Pamplona. No one yet, as far as I know, has been seriously injured, but we worry. The week before, we worry there may not be enough flowers for everybody to participate, but there we are, we did it again. It takes all of us being thoughtful and patient for this to work. And now that everyone has a camera on their phone, there's that too, right? But it always ends up being glorious and joyful. It's our special Easter catastrophe. And I know of a mainline church in Atlanta where there was also an Easter floral tradition going back 15 years. A tradition of having 500 lilies placed around their altar on Easter Sunday. 500 lilies. I don't know why 500, but for 15 years running, there were 500 beautifully arranged lilies swamping the high altar in a seriously large church. Some years it was just a bank of lilies. Other years they'd mix it up and put them in the shape of a cross. Sometimes they'd be carelessly strewn like an artist spattering paint across a large canvas. No matter, it was always beautiful. Now add to that, these were memorial lilies. People gave $5 each for one in memory of someone they loved. And of course, that meant that the insert in the worship bulletin on Easter had 500 names. 500 names. It was huge. 500 departed souls remembered by the giving of a lily. So there it was, 500 lilies at $5 each. Big, beautiful. Well, in the 16th year of that tradition, the whole grand thing came apart at the seams. Let me explain. It began innocently enough. One of the elderly members of the church, a woman, went forward immediately following the morning service and said, "I'm going to the hospital to visit Margaret Campbell. She's had a fall." Margaret was one of their well-known members. "It's okay, isn't it?" she said, "if I take one of the lilies to give to Margaret. Of course, I can't tell which one it is I donated, but just any of them will do. They all look the same." And without really getting permission from anybody, she went up the chancel steps to the cross of flowers, all 500, to get one. And then standing amongst the sea of lilies, she stopped cold. And instinctively, she turned around to address the hundreds of people still in the sanctuary. And in a slightly shocked voice, she said, "They're plastic." All at once, it got really quiet. She repeated herself. "The lilies, they're all plastic." Well, nearly everybody heard her. Very soon, there was a lot of commotion bubbling over about the 500 flowery trumpets of Easter being artificial. Someone said, "We gave $5 for lilies and they're plastic?" Someone else said, yeah, and they may be the same ones as last year, and we gave $5 then too. So quickly, little huddles formed, church members, church board members, staff members. The whole tradition was collapsing. Someone, a teenager, did the math in his head. You know, over 15 years, that's $37,500 for the same plastic lilies. So the minister, hearing a great deal of disaffection, gathered those concerned together and tried to defend the practice of having plastic flowers. His defense went along two lines. The practical defense he offered in response to the donated money was that it was used to replenish a contingency fund, something to help transients and also meet emergencies that had not been budgeted. Let me assure you, he said, the money has gone to good use. Well, there was reluctant acceptance by some and outright rejection by others. His backup line of defense was theological. He said, after all, and he said with real enthusiasm, after all, the plastic lilies are more appropriate for Easter because they always bloom. They never die. That's one way to think about it. Except, how can a thing, even a lily, made of plastic, be said to never die when it's never been alive? I mention this because for most people, maybe even for most Christians, Easter is a very antiseptic holiday. You know, it's very clean, very clean. Jesus' Easter garments are always pictured as white. I mean, just glowing white. The preferred Easter musical instruments are shining brass trumpets. There are no discordant notes on Easter, and I get that. I get it all. Except that this divorces Easter entirely from Good Friday. Good Friday meaning the day Jesus died, you know. I mean, without Good Friday, Easter never happened. It never happened. Without Good Friday, you can't have Easter because you can't have resurrection if nobody's dead. Now, the tradition insists Jesus was dead. He wasn't sleeping, he was dead. All the texts say that. Yes, and in this morning's text from John 20, the resurrected Jesus comes to his friends and he says, this comes after the reading part today, see the scars, see the nail prints. Let me tell you why I'm going over this. It's not because I think I can use the Bible to prove anything about the resurrection. You can't do that. The Easter stories are just the 2,000-year-old tradition speaking its mind. The worst Easter sermons I've heard go to great lengths to try to prove the resurrection. Preachers do logical backflips with it, and it just winds up being awkward and embarrassing. Nor am I bringing this up to make a plea for us to have faith. Faith has its place. Of course, it really does. No, I'm bringing up the biblical witness to the scars and nail prints and the physical death of Jesus because we, all of us, naturally tend to want to ignore that part of the story. We all want to ignore that basic reality of our own mortal existence. It's only natural. I mean, the older we get, the more space in our psyche is taken up with that basic anxiety. Well, it seems to me that this Sunday, Easter Sunday, is as good a time as any to address that. And the only way to address it effectively is to keep the bookends of Easter and Good Friday together as all New Testament biblical writers intend. And the way I propose to do that this Easter Sunday is to quote at length from an address a man named Alan Watts gave some 60 years ago. Alan Watts was so interesting. He was, I don't know if you've heard of him, an Episcopal priest who was also a Zen Buddhist. He lived on a houseboat in Sausalito, California, just 8 miles from where I was living in the early 1960s. He possessed one of the most nimble minds I've ever witnessed. And I say witnessed because he came to my college back when I was 20, and I was in awe of this man. Here's a bit of what he had to say about human beings and the problem of death. He spoke of death in a way that captured my attention like nothing I'd ever heard before. He began by saying that the experience of dying was like going over a waterfall. That's how he phrased it. Here's what he said. The whole problem is that there really is no other recourse than to go over that waterfall when it comes. Just as you go over any other waterfall, just as you go on from day to day, just as you go to sleep at night. See, we don't get nervous about going to sleep at night. No, of course not, because we're sleepy. And we're pretty sure that the other end of sleep is a gentle waking up, right? Well, Alan Watts continued with this. Now, I'm not preaching, he said. I'm not saying you ought to be willing to die and that you should muscle up your courage and somehow put on a good front when the terrible thing comes. That's not the idea at all. The point is that you can only die well if you understand that living and dying are just two parts of the same thing. If you do, you will understand that death is merely your disappearance as the form in which you think you are you. Death is merely your disappearance as the form in which you think you are you, not the real you. He says, your disappearance as this particular organism is simply seasonal. Look, you are just as much the dark space beyond death as you are the light interval called life. These are just two sides of you because you are the total of those two manifestations. And then Alan Watts likened our lives to waves. You see, you can't have half a wave. Nobody ever saw waves that just had crests and no troughs. In the same way, you can't have half a human being who is born but doesn't die. That would be only half a thing. Life is like a radio wave. It simply goes on, but its cycles are short cycles and long ones. There are solid vibrations that come along periodically with large spaces in between. He said, we're all like those waves, part solid and a large part open space. And then he carried the analogy even further. Space, you see, he said, is not just nothing. Now, this is the critical part of his argument. Space, you see, is not just nothing. If I could magnify my hand to an enormous degree so you could see all the molecules in it, I don't know how far apart they'd be, but physicists tell us they would be something like tennis balls in a very, very large space, a huge gymnasium. And you look when I move my hand like this and say, look, for God's sake, look at all those tennis balls. They're all moving together as one. Crazy. And there are no strings tying them together. Isn't that queer? No, but there's space going with them, and space is a function and an inseparable aspect of whatever solids are in that space. Then he offered an even better analogy. It's exactly like when those marvelous sandpipers come around here, the little ones. While they're in the air flying, they have one mind. And they move all together. And when they alight on the mud, they become individuals and they go pecking around for worms or whatever. Yes, but one click of your fingers and all those birds go up in the air as one again. And look, they don't seem to have a leader because they don't follow any one bird when they turn. No, they all turn together and go off in a different direction and do it again and again. And it's amazing. And they are exactly like the molecules in my hand. Alan Watts was telling us that our bodies and the cycles of our lives are way more complex and magical than any of us can imagine. They are not a bit accidental. You know, all the best spiritual teachers say the same thing. And they say it pretty much the same way. Alan Watts, the Dalai Lama, Ram Dass, Father Richard Rohr, all the mystics of every enduring religious tradition on earth. They all tell us that death is perfectly safe. It's like taking off a tight shoe. That's all it is. Like taking off a too tight shoe. Can also be a little like a ride over a waterfall if you're nervous. And look, these teachers don't tell us that we shouldn't resist change. No, they don't scold us when we find something somewhat frightening like that. They model that in their persons. You can see that clearly in the Easter Jesus. Alan Watts sums the whole thing up this way. First, you can't hang on to yourself. That's a given. And second, you don't have to do any spiritual heavy lifting to learn how not to hang on to yourself either. No, when worry over death comes, just remind yourself that death is no more than taking off a tight shoe. Making a simple meditation of telling yourself that can train you in peace. It can change your living, and it can change your dying. I want to conclude with a story about someone who received that very gift of liberation, and it changed her, and it changed her relationships too. It's told by a woman named Ellen Powell. We had a rocky time together, my 89-year-old mother and I. She'd never been easy to get along with. Maybe I wasn't easy either. But finally, when I was 42, I gave up hoping she'd turn into the kind of mother I always wanted. When I got word that she was dying, I started to spend a lot of time visiting her. The first month after she got her prognosis, she was very depressed and distant. She either slept or stared at the wall, her face a mask of misery. One day during that month, I was sitting in the chair next to her bed. The sun had set and her room was almost completely dark. I shifted my chair closer and rested my elbows on the edge of her bed. She reached out her hand to touch my face and stroked it very gently. It was a wonderful thing. Some days later, I was playing a game of gin rummy with my mother, and she was cheating like crazy when she announced that she had to go to the bathroom. On the way, she let out a long breath and collapsed. I caught her and lowered her to the floor. She eventually let out a long, final breath. Her pulse stopped. She was completely still. I held her there for a moment, frozen. I thought about what an honor that she had chosen me to die with. I held her in my arms for a few minutes, wondering how long it would take before someone would come in. All of a sudden, her body jerked. I almost jumped out of my skin. She was alive. There we were on the floor, two living people, one holding the other. Two attendants finally found us. We got her up and back into bed. And 10 minutes later, my mother was beating me in a game of rummy, cheating like mad. Later that day, I was sitting on the edge of my mother's bed. I can only imagine how stunned and exhausted I must have looked, because she said to me, "Now, dear, when I'm really dying, not one of these dress rehearsals I seem to be having, but when I'm really going, I want you to know that I'll be kissing you all over." And then she fluttered her hands around my head with love pouring from her eyes, saying, "Kiss, kiss, 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 kiss." Something was happening to her. She was being remade. I'd never seen her so full of joy. The next day, the phone rang. It was Sister Pat, a nun who worked with the hospice organization that was caring for my mother. I told Sister Pat that my mother had made a complete turnaround in the past 24 hours. I told her how had been completely and inconsolably miserable, and that now, after what had happened, she seemed happy and content. It was like night and day, I said. There was a long pause. Then Sister Pat said, "Your mother is a very fortunate woman." "Huh?" I said, thinking, she's dying. That's fortunate? Sister Pat continued. In her 20-odd years of working with dying people, she said she had observed that the ones who had experienced little deaths were very peaceful for the rest of their lives. She said it was as if they got to take a little look-see and realize there was really nothing to be afraid of on the other side. My mother and I had 6 more months after that. She had 5 more dress rehearsals and was proud of them all. We never talked about much, just the weather, bits of news, but it didn't matter anymore because we lived inside a little blue egg of light, and the love poured back and forth between us inside the little egg. I finally got the mother I've been waiting